So Elena, let's invite you in.
Thank you, Kurt. And thank you to the whole team for organizing this opportunity. Thank you for all the contributors so far and a lot of the collaborative work that has gone behind the scenes to make this possible. I would like to just share the main focus of my work in this book, Global Unitive Healing. As Doug already said, the core message of Global Unitive Healing is that our coming into wholeness in this planetary age has everything to do with the language we draw on to communicate our experience, process, and purpose. Language literally structures the human psyche. It shapes the ways we think about our experience, what we notice, what we consider possible, what we focus on. In a way, we can think about language as providing what Russian psychologists from the early part of the 20th century, Vygotsky, called the zone of proximal development. Language, in a way, scaffolds not just what we experience, but also what we're oriented towards experiencing, what we are growing into. And so it also shapes our experience of well-being or conflict. I view language as the powerful, invisible variable that can bring about the collective developmental shift into the evolution of our human consciousness. Let's think for a moment what is characteristic of the prevalent public language and discourse in much of which we swim unconsciously. Some of the most debilitating characteristics of that language are, on the one end, it is significantly flattened, reduced to the tangible, the functional, the expedient, the pragmatic, the crass. On the other end of the spectrum, trying to present an alternative to this flattened language is another type of language which is highly intellectualized, highly conceptual, highly cognitive. It certainly offers maps and ways to think about complex processes, but somehow it does not necessarily engage souls. And therefore, it does not bring about transformation. In the middle between these two extremes, the flattened language and the highly intellectualized language, stands the language that fills our public space with ideological contention. And that's yet another characteristic of the language we're immersed in. So there's a lot of clamor using language in our public spaces right now, precisely because, as Claudia said, for most people, there are really no maps of how to move forward. And so how can this clamor actually be turned into a powerful leverage for transformation? My book introduces a universal spiritual language that truly fosters up our waking up, our growing up, cleaning up, showing up, opening up, as well as linking up and lifting up. This new level of unitive language was really not possible on a large scale until the mid-19th century when it first emerged, for all the developmental and evolutionary collective reasons that have been analyzed quite well in Doug's presentation and in the historic perspective that Ken Wilber offered us. Humanity was not ready evolutionarily for this language until the mid-19th century. And so this new unitive evolutionary language contained insights that were previously implicit in the core teachings and mystical experiences of all the great world religions. But for the first time, it synthesized these insights into a modern integral language, accessible to every person, and somehow speaking to every person, despite the widely varying levels and stages of development that have been discussed here so far. This language was brought by the great 19th century spiritual teacher, Baha'u'llah. In the past 170 years, this language of wholeness has increasingly permeated collective consciousness. It's profound to reflect on the fact, though, that an integral language, a language that can speak to every level and rank of humanity, cannot be invented, and it does not develop haphazardly. Because it is a systematic phenomenon, it's a systemic phenomenon. It emerges when timely, and it expresses the integral nature of reality. So, 20th century famous psychiatrist Erich Fromm spoke to that when he wrote that the kind of universalist spiritual system and language that corresponds to and advances the evolution of the human race cannot be invented. It will come into existence with the appearance of a new great teacher. And indeed, this language that was first expressed in the teachings of the great spiritual teacher Baha'u'llah combined and synthesized the spiritual insights of the East and West with the rational insights of science and developmental theory. And for the first time, unlike what Ken Wilber said about all the great religious traditions of the past, here was a spiritual system that spoke consistently, eloquently, and in contemporary language to our growing up, as well as to our waking up, as well as to our cleaning up, showing up, and opening up. By the time Baha'u'llah spoke, the impacts of industrialization on language and consciousness had already become clear. So this language, what's really amazing about it is that it cannot be claimed by any group. It is a language that is freely offered to humanity. And in the past 100 years, and particularly in recent decades, the global Baha'i community has been engaged in a radical planetary social action endeavor, creating these open circles for all people from all convictions, from all identities, to partake in the experience of this universal spiritual language that fosters community development towards a global community. This language speaks to the fullness of the human soul. It ennobles, it differentiates, but it does not divide. Rather, it connects us across our different identities, and it encourages mature, awakened, and responsible relationships on every level, as it also infuses human interactions with truth, beauty, and goodness. That is the healing unitive language I write about. And I have seen people in all developmental places respond to this language, feel moved by this language, perhaps because it really shows up to every aspect of reality. It brings together the true, the good, and the beautiful in a way that the human soul responds, even when cognitively we may not quite understand what it is we're experiencing. The beauty of this language is that it offered universal spiritual principles, which are recognizable in all the wisdom traditions of the past, and that these principles work literally like an alphabet. So on the one hand, the language was first expressed in the middle of the 19th century. On the other hand, we are currently, all of us, co-creating this language as individuals and as organizations, as we are working cooperatively and realizing together foundational unitive realities. So again, this language is liberating. It does not belong to anybody. We're opening ourselves up to it and we're co-creating. This is a genuinely interspiritual language. And I'd like to give you just a few examples before I close. I will draw these examples on from a collection of mystical gems that capture the inner essence of world spiritual teachings. But this inner essence is dressed in the garment of brevity, and it crystallizes reality principles into crisp and elevating propositions. It is, for me, the epitome of showing up for the true, the good, and the beautiful. And it is really an antidote to our fragmentation. And I'll just give you some very short examples. O Son of Being, possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart, that thine may be a sovereignty ancient, imperishable, and everlasting. You can notice here how the ethic of a spiritual attitude to life, the ethic of alignment with our inner center and also with eternal reality, is offered in a language that resonates with our longing for truth, with our longing for beauty and goodness, but at the same time, the language is completely non-dogmatic. It makes no belief claims. Here's another one. Justice is my gift to thee. By its aid, thou shalt see with thine own eyes and not through the eyes of others. In my earlier work, I was focused on the nature and ontogenesis of critical moral consciousness, of our ability to discern and to engage with discernment, the ways that we exercise our free will. All of this that theoretically can be explained with complex models and has been explained with complex models is really condensed in this three-liner. And here's another one. And this one speaks to and calls humans of every walk of life to transcend narrower identities towards a global fellowship. The words are like this. The gates that open on the placeless stand wide. The gates that open on the placeless stand wide. And yet another one. Burst thy cage asunder, and even as the phoenix of love, soar into the firmament of holiness. Examples abound, but I will close with my favorite example, which is actually included partially in the dedication of the book, that the hyacinths of knowledge and wisdom may spring up fresh and green from the holy city of the heart. Thank you.
Great, Elena and Doug, thank you so much. And following particularly on Ken and Claudia. So now we want to devote about 10 minutes to letting Doug and Elena talk to each other. So I think if we can bring them both up and start with you, Doug, I think the two of you can just do it extemporaneously and it will just flow by itself. So Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. I've got a couple of questions actually in reading your book that I hope you can help me with. I noticed that you in the book, Elena, talk about the language of consultation. Could you differentiate between a language of consultation and the typical kind of conversation that we're used to?
Thank you. That's a good question, because consultation is a great example of the qualitative shift that this new language is inviting us towards. So consultation is a different attitude and a different condition than our usual communication. It approaches a question from the point of view of creating distance between our individual positions and identities and the wisdom that flows through us. And so in order to enter into consultation, people have to cultivate detachment first from their positions, from their identities. And
Yes.
so then wisdom flows through, and there's, for everybody else, engagement in the act of deep listening. And then with this deep listening, wisdom flows through the next person. And then it's again deep listened through to. And wisdom flows through the next person. And it's much like the Native American practice of circle. It probably what's different about it is that it is a very deliberately cultivated practice of really coming into every decision, into every question from a place of detachment, from a place of deep listening, from a place of knowing in advance that whatever solution or answer emerges, it will emerge organically as from the whole, and it will not belong to any person, and there will be no identity or label attached to it. So this consultative process really is a way for us to align with spiritual reality, with the wisdom of the universe, and allowing that to flow through our circles until solutions are evident. So again, this is this universal spiritual attitude that carries no labels, makes no belief claims. It is, it just calls to the depth of our spiritual reality. It just calls to our souls to come forth with our souls.
That's excellent. And of course, this is a conversation that we have also, and that is that the more one is attached to an identity that is a particularism, the less likely it is they're able to hear, or as in the narrative that many of them study, having eyes you don't see and ears you don't hear. And it does relate to one's ability to detach and become open enough so that that deep listening can take place. And those are the kinds of conversations that we would have as well. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was in chapter 6, you talk about the deep psychology of our lives. How would you link that deep psychology of our lives to language?
It's really fascinating when we look at the fact that through millennia, people have given and tried to give many different names to this ancient eternal reality that arms us with the deepest endurance, that delivers us and awakens our ability to see things more deeply and fear them less. We can name this ancient reality, and we do try to, but we can never really know it. And it seems that it is in the seeking after this unknowable reality that we are steered and we gradually become stronger, kinder, and clearer. And that to me seems to be the depth psychology of our journey, that in this seeking of the unknowable is how we grow and how we show up and how we become whole, really.
Yes, and this is why we'll propose for people that we take a trans-narrative approach, which means that rather than a narrative having a role and function of defining a particularism, a narrative is transformative, not for form, but transform. So the narrative becomes the finger. I don't attach to the narrative. What I want to know is, of all the narratives that are out there, when I'm talking to someone else, I want to know, what is your narrative, so that I can find out what is it that your narrative points to. So we can talk about the nature of that which narratives or language points to. And that's that universal space, that universal spirituality that I hear you talking about. And that helps to detach, in our case, even from the biblical narrative itself, so that we don't have a conversion mentality that is so prevalent as you move to the first tier levels and stages. And that does prevent that deep listening that you talk about earlier. One other question, if we have time, I want to put you on the spot here a little bit with solving our world problems, Elena. Could you give an example of how a universal spiritual language can offer a clear horizon of vision amidst our current turbulence?
You know, there is actually, there is a quote, an example of that somewhere in, I believe, chapter 6, where I quote Abdu'l-Baha, who was the son of the great spiritual teacher Baha'u'llah. Abdu'l-Baha in 1912 traveled across the whole US from east to west. And in 1912, he gave many talks across the country, but this particular one was a talk he gave at the Unitarian Church in New York City, where he said the following words. So here's a language, completely non-denominational, no beliefs, but it really sounds like truth, beauty, and goodness wrapped together, the very opposite of the fragmentation of the modern age, and really showing a horizon to a humanity that was heading into 2 world wars. And here's what he said. In this century of illumination, hearts are inclined towards agreement and fellowship, and minds are thoughtful about the question of the unification of mankind. There is an emanation of the universal consciousness. These prophetic words were spoken in 1912, and the reception to these words was profound. Papers and publications across the country were quoting his words, and people were responding to something that they weren't recognizing yet, but it was eliciting a response. This is the surest way of how a language can really open a horizon before we even grasp that horizon. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that question.